She stood in a ballroom of 400 souls, and not one of them would remember her name the way she earned it. They would remember the slap. They would remember the sound of her palm cracking against perfumed skin. But none of them, not a single powdered face in that chandelier-lit cathedral of lies, would remember what she already knew, that the woman she struck was a killer, and the man who threw her out was too blind to see the blood on his own sheets. This is the story of Lady Seraphine Vale, and if you stay until the very end, you will never forget her. Drop a like, leave your city in the comments, and settle in. This one burns. Pues say at. The candles in the grand hall of Ashenmoor Palace numbered 612. Seraphine had counted them once, years ago, during the first banquet she ever attended as a girl of 15, dragged by her father into a world that smelled of roasted duck and quiet treachery. She had counted them because she had nothing else to do. No one spoke to her. No one looked at her. She was the youngest daughter of a minor lord whose bloodline carried weight, but whose coffers carried dust. Now she was 23. Now the candles did not matter. Now every pair of eyes in this room was a weapon, and every whisper behind a silk fan was a blade sliding between ribs she could not protect. She stood near the eastern colonnade, her fingers wrapped around a glass of wine she had not sipped. Her gown was the color of deep winter, almost black, threaded with silver that caught the light only when she moved, which she had not done in 11 minutes. She knew because she had been counting again. Not candles this time. Minutes. Minutes since Lucian had entered the hall with Evelyn Marrow on his arm, her gloved hand resting on his sleeve like she owned the bone beneath it. 11 minutes of watching her fiancé parade another woman through a room full of people who once bowed to Seraphine's future title. "You're grinding your teeth again." The voice came from her left. Lord Aldrich Thorne, her father's oldest political ally and the only man in this palace who still spoke to her without first checking who was watching. "I'm aware," Seraphine said. "You're also white-knuckling that glass hard enough to crack it." "Also aware." Aldrich stepped closer. He was 62, built like a fence post wrapped in velvet, and his breath always carried the faint bite of tobacco he pretended not to smoke. "Walk away tonight, girl. Whatever you're thinking, swallow it. This room is not your battlefield." "Every room is a battlefield, Aldrich. You taught me that." "I taught you to pick the ones you can win." Seraphine's jaw tightened. Across the hall, Evelyn laughed. A sound like crystal tapped with a silver spoon, perfect and precise and utterly practiced. She wore ivory. Of course she wore ivory. The woman dressed like a saint and moved like a serpent. And somehow the entire court had decided she was the victim in a story Seraphine had not yet been allowed to tell. "She's doing it on purpose," Seraphine murmured. "Of course she's doing it on purpose. That woman does nothing by accident, which is exactly why you need to—" "I'm not leaving," Aldrich exhaled through his nose. "Then at least put the wine down before you shatter the glass and bleed all over the marble." Hard to look dignified with a sliced palm. She set the glass on the nearest table without looking at it. Her eyes never left Evelyn. The woman was leaning toward Lucien now, whispering something that made him smile. That private, crooked smile he used to give Seraphine in the library when no one else was around, when the world was smaller and the lies had not yet metastasized into something she could no longer cut out. The Royal Unity Banquet was held once a year. It was supposed to celebrate the alliance between the great houses. In practice, it was a performance. A night when enemies kissed cheeks and allies sharpened knives, and everyone pretended the kingdom was not rotting from the inside. The king himself was absent tonight, bedridden with an illness the court physicians refused to name, which meant the Crown Council oversaw the ceremony, which meant Duke Lucien Ravenscar, first seat of the council, heir to the largest military estate in the eastern provinces, was effectively the most powerful man in the room. And he had brought his mistress, not officially. Officially, Evelyn Marrow was a visiting diplomat's niece. Officially, she was a guest of the crown. Officially, she had no connection to Lucien beyond cordial acquaintance, but Seraphine had watched them for 3 months now. She had seen the way his hand found the small of Evelyn's back when he thought no one was watching. She had seen the notes delivered to his private study in handwriting that did not belong to any secretary. She had seen the way Evelyn's quarters were moved twice, each time closer to Lucien's wing of the palace. And she had seen something else, something that turned the jealousy into ice. 3 weeks ago, a man named Henrik Solvan, a clerk in the royal treasury who had been called to testify before the Crown Council about missing military funds, vanished. His quarters were cleaned out overnight. His family was told he had accepted a post abroad. No one questioned it. No one even blinked. Because in this palace, people disappeared the way candle wax melted, slowly, silently, and without anyone bothering to replace what was lost. Seraphine had known Henrik, not well, but well enough to know that he did not have family abroad. He did not have ambitions abroad. He had a cat and a stack of ledgers and a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles when he was frightened. And the last time Seraphine saw him alive, he was frightened. He had pulled her aside after a council session and whispered 4 words that had burrowed into her skull like a worm into wet wood. The diplomat's niece. Careful. Then he was gone. And now Seraphine stood in a room full of 612 candles, watching the woman Henrik had warned her about laugh on the arm of the man Seraphine was supposed to marry. And every cell in her body was screaming 2 different things at once: run and fight. Lady Vale, the voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade through smoke. Seraphine turned. Evelyn Marrow stood 3 paces away, her smile as flawless as a painted mask. Up close, the woman was devastating. Cheekbones that could cut paper, eyes the color of wet stone, a mouth that curved like it was always on the verge of telling you something you would regret hearing. "Miss Marrow," Seraphine said. Her voice came out flat. "Good. I was hoping we might speak," Evelyn said. "Privately, if you prefer. But I thought, given the occasion, it might be better to clear the air here, among friends." Seraphine's pulse kicked. Among friends. The woman had chosen those words the way a general chose terrain. This ballroom, these witnesses, these 400 pairs of ears. Evelyn wanted an audience. "Clear the air about what?" Seraphine asked. Evelyn tilted her head. The gesture was almost tender, almost compassionate, and entirely for show. "I understand there have been rumors about my relationship with Duke Ravenscar, and I want you to know, from my own lips, that I would never stop." The word came out harder than Seraphine intended, or maybe exactly as hard as she intended. She was not sure anymore. The line between strategy and survival had blurred weeks ago. Evelyn blinked. The mask held, but something flickered behind her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. "I appreciate the performance," Seraphine continued. Her voice was low, but the nearest clusters of nobles had already stopped pretending not to listen. "But we both know what you are, Miss Marrow. And we both know this conversation is not about clearing the air. It's about making me look unstable in front of people who are already waiting for me to crack." Silence rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Fans stopped moving. Glasses paused midway to lips. The string quartet in the corner kept playing, but even their tempo seemed to falter. Evelyn's smile did not waver. If anything, it deepened. "Lady Vale, I think perhaps you've been under a great deal of strain. No one would blame you for what? For noticing? For paying attention while every other person in this room buries their head in champagne and pretends the kingdom isn't hemorrhaging from the inside." "Seraphine," Lucien's voice, low, warning, coming from behind Evelyn like a shadow-given sound. He stepped forward, and the crowd parted for him the way it always did. Not because they respected him, but because they feared the weight of his name. He was tall, broad, built like something designed to stand between other people and whatever they were afraid of. His jaw was set, his dark eyes fixed on Seraphine with an expression she recognized from 100 quiet arguments in candlelit rooms. Controlled disappointment. "Not here," he said. "Then where, Lucien?" Seraphine shot back. "Because I've tried your study. I've tried the council chamber. I've tried the private corridor outside your quarters at 2 a.m. when I could hear her voice through your door. Where exactly would you prefer I bring up the fact that your guest has been—" "Enough." The word hit like a slammed door. Lucien's composure cracked just enough for something raw to show. Not anger exactly, but the kind of rigid authority that men wielded when they knew they were wrong and could not afford to admit it. He stepped between Evelyn and Seraphine, and the positioning alone told the entire story. He was shielding her, protecting her. In front of every noble family that had ever pledged loyalty to his house, Evelyn placed a hand on Lucien's arm. Her fingers trembled, perfectly. Exactly the right amount of trembling. Not too much, not too little. The kind of trembling that made a man feel protective and made a crowd feel sympathetic. "It's all right, Lucien," Eveline whispered, just loud enough for the nearest dozen people to hear. "She's hurting. I understand." Seraphine felt something detonate inside her chest. Not rage. She had moved past rage weeks ago. This was something colder. The recognition that she was standing in a room full of people who had already decided who the villain was, and no amount of words would change it. The truth was a locked door, and every key she had was being slapped from her hand by a woman who smiled like a martyr, while the bodies of missing witnesses gathered dust in unmarked graves. And then Eveline did the thing that broke the last thread of Seraphine's restraint. She leaned into Lucien, just slightly, just a fraction of a degree, and let her temple brush his shoulder. The gesture was so small that most people would miss it. But Seraphine saw it. And more importantly, Eveline knew Seraphine saw it, because Eveline's eyes were open, fixed on Seraphine. And in those stone-gray irises there was no fear, no sympathy, just the quiet, satisfied certainty of a woman who had already won. Seraphine's hand moved before her mind finished the thought. The slap cracked through the ballroom like a gunshot. Eveline's head snapped sideways, her carefully arranged hair scattering across her cheek, and the sound, that sharp, wet, undeniable sound, hit every surface in the hall and came back twice as loud. 400 people stopped breathing. Eveline's hand flew to her cheek. Her eyes widened, and then, and this was the part that would haunt Seraphine for months, she began to cry. Not sobbing, not wailing, just tears sliding down her reddened cheek like rain on marble, silent and beautiful and devastating. "Lucien," Eveline breathed, just his name, just the shape of it in her mouth, and it was enough. Lucien turned to Seraphine. His face had gone blank. Not angry, not shocked. Blank. The way a wall looks before someone drives a fist through it. She had seen that expression once before, the night his brother died, when the messenger arrived at the estate and Lucien stood in the doorway and said nothing for 9 full minutes. "Guards," Lucien said. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. 2 men in ceremonial armor materialized from the nearest alcove. They flanked Seraphine without touching her. They did not need to touch her. The command was clear. The humiliation was already complete. "Lucien," Seraphine said. She hated that her voice cracked. She hated that the crack sounded like pleading when it was actually the sound of something inside her finally snapping. "You need to listen to me. She is not. Remove Lady Vale from the hall." The words landed on Seraphine's chest like a stone slab. Not escort, remove. Like furniture, like a stain, like something that had soiled the evening and needed to be taken out before it spread. The guards stepped closer. One of them, young, barely 20, his face tight with the discomfort of a man who knew he was participating in something wrong, murmured, "My lady, please." Seraphine looked at Lucien one last time. He was not looking at her. He had turned back to Eveline, his hand on her shoulder, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw where the slap had landed. The tenderness of the gesture was obscene, not because it existed, but because it was public, because he was choosing, in front of every person who mattered in the kingdom, to comfort the woman he was not engaged to, while the woman he was engaged to was dragged away like a criminal. Seraphine straightened her spine. She pulled her arm from the guard's loose grip. Not violently, just firmly, the way you pull a door shut when you know you are never coming back through it. She walked. She did not run. She did not look over her shoulder. She did not give them the satisfaction of watching her crumble. But she felt it, every step. The weight of 400 gazes on her back, each one a verdict delivered without trial. Jealous, unhinged, desperate. She could hear the words forming in the silence behind her, assembling like bricks in a wall that would soon be too high to see over. The double doors closed behind her. The sound was final. Not like an ending, like a burial. The corridor outside the grand hall was long and cold, and lit by torches that cast everything in shades of copper and shadow. Seraphine walked until the music faded, until the laughter became a distant hum, until her footsteps were the only sound left in the world. Then she stopped. She pressed her back against the stone wall. She slid down until she was sitting on the floor, her gown pooling around her like spilled ink, and she pressed both hands flat against the marble beneath her because she needed to feel something solid, something that would not shift or lie or disappear in the night. Her palms stung. The right one, the one that had struck Evelyn, throbbed with a dull, persistent heat that felt like accusation. "Stupid," she whispered. "Stupid, stupid, stupid." Not because she had slapped the woman, because she had done it without proof, without leverage, without anything but rage and exhaustion and the suffocating certainty that she was the only person in this palace who could see the fire while everyone else stood around complimenting the warmth. She reached inside the hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her gown, a modification she had made herself 3 weeks ago because she had learned early that women in palaces needed places to hide things that men would never think to search. Her fingers closed around a folded piece of paper. She pulled it out, unfolded it on her knees. It was a list. 9 names. Henrik Solvani was the 7th. 6 of the 9 were already gone. Vanished. Relocated. Deceased. Every single one had been connected to the treason investigation the Crown Council had launched 8 months ago, a quiet probe into the misappropriation of military funds that should have armed the northern border, but instead had vanished into a network of shell accounts and phantom suppliers. And every single one of them had interacted with Evelyn Marrow in the weeks before they disappeared. Seraphine stared at the list, her vision blurred. She blinked until it cleared. She could not afford to cry. Crying was a luxury for women who had someone left to comfort them. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. She folded the list, shoved it back into her pocket, and scrambled to her feet just as Aldrich rounded the corner. His face was tight, his eyes were wet, though he would deny it until the day he died. "How bad?" she asked. He stopped 3 paces away. He did not sugarcoat it. He never did. That was why she trusted him. "The Countess of Ashbourne is already composing letters to every major house. By morning, you will be known as the jealous fiancée who assaulted an innocent woman at a royal banquet. The narrative is set, Seraphine. You cannot fight it with a red palm and no evidence." "I have evidence. You have suspicions. You have patterns. You have a dead clerk's whisper and a list of names that no court in this kingdom would accept without corroboration. That is not evidence. That is a woman shouting into a storm and wondering why no one hears her." Seraphine leaned against the wall. Her head throbbed. Her hand throbbed. Her pride throbbed. Everything was one enormous, synchronized pulse of pain. "Then I get corroboration." "How?" "The 8th name on my list, Lord Dashton of the Southern Chancellery. He was Henrik's contact in the Treasury audits. If anyone has copies of the original ledgers, it's him." Aldrich's expression shifted. The wetness in his eyes dried, replaced by something sharper. The look of a man who had spent 4 decades in court politics and knew exactly what a dangerous idea sounded like. "Dashton is a ghost. He hasn't been seen publicly in 2 months, which means either he's dead or he's hiding. And if he's hiding for a reason. People don't disappear because they have nothing to say, Aldrich. They disappear because they have too much. Or because someone made sure they would never say it at all." Silence. The torch nearest to them popped and spat a shower of sparks that died before they hit the floor. "I'm going to find him," Seraphine said. "You're going to get yourself killed. Maybe. But sitting here waiting for Evelyn to bury me is a different kind of dying, and I refuse to go quietly." Aldrich studied her for a long moment. The torchlight carved deep shadows into the lines of his face, turning him into something ancient and weary and fundamentally decent in a world that punished decency like a crime. "Your father would tell you to retreat, to protect what's left of your name, to accept the engagement is over and build a new life somewhere quiet. My father is dead, Aldrich, and he died quiet. He died retreating. He died protecting a name that nobody remembers anyway." She pushed off the wall. Her spine straightened, her shoulders settled. Something in her posture changed. Not confidence exactly, but the grim, bone-deep resolve of a woman who had just lost everything except the one thing that mattered. "I'm not him." Aldrich said nothing for a long time. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. He held it out to her. "Henrik gave me this 2 days before he disappeared. I was waiting for the right time to tell you. I suppose getting slapped out of a royal banquet qualifies." Seraphine took the journal. It was thin, worn, the leather cracked along the spine. She opened it. Inside, in Henrik's cramped, nervous handwriting, were columns of numbers, dates, and initials, financial records, transaction trails, and on the last page, circled 3 times in red ink, 2 words that made Seraphine's blood freeze in her veins. She read them twice, 3 times. 4. The torch behind her guttered and died. The corridor plunged into half-darkness, and in that darkness, with Henrik's journal open in her trembling hands, Seraphine understood, with perfect, terrible clarity, that everything she thought she knew about Evelyn Marrow was only the surface. The 2 words stared up at her from the page. Ravenscar, brother. The implications detonated behind her eyes like a collapsing ceiling. Lucian's brother, the one who died 3 years ago in what the kingdom had mourned as a tragic accident. The hunting trip gone wrong. The horse. The cliff. The body recovered 2 days later from the river below, too broken for an open casket. Seraphine's hands stopped trembling. Her breathing steadied. Her heart, which had been slamming against her ribs for the last hour, settled into something slow and cold and precise. "Aldrich?" she said. Her voice was quiet. Quiet the way the edge of a blade is quiet. Henrik didn't just find financial crimes. Aldrich's face was unreadable. No, he did not. She killed his brother. I don't know that. Neither do you. What Henrik found was a connection, a transaction, a payment routed through one of Evelyn's shell accounts to a mercenary company based out of the southern marshlands, the same company that supplied the guides for Lucian's brother's hunting expedition. It could be coincidence. You don't believe in coincidence. You told me that when I was 16. I also told you that accusations without airtight proof are just a fancier way of committing political suicide. And right now, Seraphine, you are standing on the edge of a cliff that makes your father's grave look like a garden path. She closed the journal. She held it against her chest the way a soldier holds a shield, not because it would stop the blow, but because the act of holding it reminded her she was still fighting. Then I build the case. I find Dashton. I trace every transaction in this journal, and when I walk back into that palace, I walk in with proof so thick they can't burn it fast enough. And Lucienne? The name hit her like a fist she had been expecting but could not dodge. She swallowed. The ache in her chest was not love. Not anymore. It was the phantom pain of something amputated, the ghost of a future she had spent years building that had been ripped out of her hands by a woman in ivory who cried on command. Lucien made his choice tonight, Seraphine said. He chose her. In front of every house, every lord, every person who will ever write about this moment. He chose her. And if the proof leads where you think it leads, if she really did arrange his brother's death, he will have to face that. The guilt alone. The guilt is his problem. My problem is staying alive long enough to make sure he faces it at all. She turned away from him. The corridor stretched before her like a throat. Long, dark, narrowing at the far end into a passage that led toward the servants' quarters, and beyond that, the stables. Her mind was already building a map. Dashton's last known estate. The road south. The contacts she could still trust, which was a list so short it fit on one hand with fingers to spare. Behind her, Aldrich's voice came one last time, low and raw, and stripped of the political armor he usually wore. Seraphine, be careful. The people who made Henrik disappear, they are not amateurs. And now that you've made a scene at the banquet, every eye in the kingdom will be on you. You will not be able to move in shadow. She paused at the edge of the torchlight. Half her face was lit, half was gone. Then I won't bother with shadows, she said. Let them watch. She stepped into the dark. The corridor swallowed her, and somewhere behind her in the grand hall where 612 candles still burned and 400 voices were already reshaping the night into a story that served their comfort, Duke Lucian Ravenscar held a woman he did not truly know and whispered reassurances to a face that was already planning its next move. Evelyn Marrow stood in Lucian's arms, her cheeks still warm from the slap, her tears drying on skin that had not flinched once since the moment Seraphine's hand connected. She rested her head on his chest. She let him stroke her hair. She let him murmur that it was over, that Seraphine would be dealt with, that she was safe. And behind his back, where his hands could not reach and his eyes could not see, Eveline's fingers curled into a slow, deliberate fist. Not in pain, not in anger, in decision. Because Seraphine Vale had just done something no one in 3 years had managed to do. She had gotten close enough to see, and Eveline Marrow did not leave witnesses. Across the ballroom, unnoticed by anyone, a servant in a gray coat slipped through a side door and vanished into the palace corridors. He moved quickly, quietly, with the practiced invisibility of a man whose job depended on never being remembered. He climbed 2 flights of stairs, turned left past the tapestry of the Battle of Greywood, and knocked twice on a door that bore no nameplate. The door opened. A woman's voice, low and clipped, spoke from the darkness within. "Well, it's done," the servant said. The Vale woman struck her. The Duke removed her publicly. The narrative is set. And the journal? The servant hesitated. 1 beat, 2. The old man gave it to her. Thorn. In the east corridor after she was removed. Silence from the room. Long enough for the servant to feel sweat bead along the back of his neck. Which journal? Henrik's. The silence changed texture. It became the kind of silence that precedes the sound of something breaking, or someone. "Find Dashton," the voice said. "Find him before she does. And if you cannot find him alive, make sure she finds him dead." The door closed. The servant descended the stairs on legs that felt less solid than they had on the way up. The torches in the corridor flickered. The music from the grand hall drifted upward through the stone, muffled and distant, like a song playing in a room where someone had already died, but the guests had not yet noticed. And in the east corridor, long after Seraphine's footsteps had faded, a single torch sputtered back to life, casting a thin blade of light across the floor where she had sat. The marble was still warm where her hands had pressed against it. The road south out of Ashenmoor smelled like wet earth and horse sweat, and the particular kind of silence that follows a disaster no one has finished processing yet. Seraphine rode hard for the first hour, not because speed would help. Dashton's estate was a full day's ride, and haste, without direction, was just panic in a saddle. But because her body needed to do something violent and controlled at the same time, and riding was the only option that did not involve burning the palace down, she slowed when the road crested the ridge above the valley. Below, the capital lights spread out like a scattered handful of embers. Ashenmoor Palace sat at the center, its towers lit with the kind of sustained, indifferent brightness that powerful buildings maintain while the people inside them suffer. The banquet was still going. The music was probably still playing. Eveline Marrow was probably still being held by the man Seraphine had spent 3 years learning to trust. She pulled her cloak tighter, the night air cut straight through wool. She did not look at the palace for long. Looking at it felt like pressing a bruise. Henrik's journal sat inside her coat, flat against her sternum. She could feel its edges. She had read every page twice in the hour before she saddled the horse, standing in the cramped servants' tack room where Aldrich had arranged for her belongings to be moved pending. Pending what, exactly, no one had said aloud. Pending her removal from the palace. Pending the formal dissolution of her engagement. Pending the burial of her name under 6 months of gossip and Eveline Marrow's well-timed tears. The journal was Henrik's voice, translated into columns and dates and initials. The handwriting got smaller and tighter as the pages progressed, the way writing does when a person is trying to say as much as possible in as small a space as possible, as if they already know they are running out of room. The last entry was dated 12 days before his disappearance. It read, "D confirms third transfer, same routing, SE holding copies. Do not approach SE directly. Too visible. Use Thorn, SE." She had no idea who SE was yet. But D was Dashton, and Dashton was holding copies of something that someone had killed to keep buried. Seraphine touched the journal through her coat. Then she kicked the horse forward into the dark. She reached the village of Cresswyn at dawn. It was not Dashton's estate, that was another 3 hours east. But Cresswyn had a public house that opened before sunrise, and a postmaster who owed Aldrich a debt Aldrich had agreed to transfer to Seraphine's name. The postmaster's name was Roan. He was a small, damp-looking man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that processed information the way a butcher processed cuts, quickly, without sentiment. Seraphine sat across from him in the back room of the public house with a mug of something hot and unidentifiable between her hands and Henrik's journal open on the table. "I need to find Dashton of the Southern Chancellery," she said. Quietly. Roan looked at the journal. His ink-stained fingers did not move. Dashton hasn't posted outbound correspondence in 43 days. Last letter he sent came through my station, addressed to the council archives. What did it say? I don't read private correspondence. Seraphine looked at him. Not a glare, something flatter. The kind of look that said she had been awake all night. She had been publicly humiliated in front of 400 people. She had ridden through darkness on a horse that smelled like old rain, and she had precisely 0 patience left for the performance of bureaucratic ethics from a man who was already sitting in a back room before sunrise. Roan's fingers moved. He reached under the table and produced a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the wood. I keep copies of unusual correspondence. Professional habit. She unfolded it. It was short. 3 lines in the kind of careful, deliberate handwriting of a man who knows he is writing something dangerous and wants it to be legible. The 3rd set exists. I cannot hold it safely. If something happens to me, look for the black trunk in my wine cellar behind the Greywood vintage. Tell no one except Vale's woman. She's the only one Solvain trusted who is still breathing. Seraphine read it twice, her thumbs pressed flat against the edges of the paper. Vale's woman. Henrik had sent her toward Dashton before he disappeared. He had planned for exactly this outcome. He had known what was coming and had laid a trail anyway, like someone marking a path through a burning building for the person who would arrive after the smoke cleared. When was this written? She asked. 43 days ago, same day as his last outbound post. And you held it. I hold unusual correspondence. Roan paused. Lord Aldrich called it professional habit when he suggested I develop the practice. I assumed it meant something. Seraphine folded the letter. She placed it alongside Henrik's journal in her coat. Is Dashton alive? Rowan's expression did not change, but his fingers, which had been perfectly still, curled against the table edge just slightly. His steward came through Cresswyn 8 days ago, buying provisions. Enough for 1 person for roughly 3 weeks. Cash, no conversation. 1 person, 3 weeks. He's hiding on the estate. That is not a conclusion I am prepared to draw. But it's the conclusion you've already drawn. Rowan picked up his own mug. He did not answer, which was answer enough. She stood. The chair scraped against the stone floor. Outside, the village was beginning to wake. The sound of a cart somewhere, a dog, the distant clank of a forge starting its day. Normal sounds. The sounds of a world that did not know what was happening inside the palace 40 miles north. What names were in a dead clerk's journal. What a woman in ivory had done to a boy who went hunting and never came back. If anyone comes through asking about me, Seraphine said, how long do I have before you tell them? Roan considered. I would be very difficult to find until after supper. That's enough. Thank you. She walked out into the gray morning. Dashton's estate sat at the end of a chalk road that the recent rain had turned into a strip of thick, pale paste. The main house was smaller than she had expected, a working estate rather than a showpiece, which made sense for a man whose power came from paper rather than land. The windows were shuttered. The front gate was closed but not locked. She dismounted, tied the horse to a fence post, and walked in through the side yard. The steward met her at the back door. A woman, actually, which surprised Seraphine. Compact, gray-haired, with the stance of a person accustomed to turning people away. I'm here to see Lord Dashton, Seraphine said. My name is... I know who you are. The steward's eyes moved to Seraphine's coat, to the shape of the journal beneath it, and then back up. Something shifted in the woman's expression, not warmth, more like the recognition of an outcome she had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. He said if a woman came alone, riding a brown horse that clearly didn't belong to her, and she had something flat pressed against her chest, let her in. Seraphine looked down at her coat. The journal's outline was visible against the fabric. She had not noticed. She had been so focused on what it contained that she had stopped being careful about how she carried it. That was the kind of mistake that got people killed. She filed it away. She would not make it again. The steward led her through a back hallway that smelled of old wood and cold ash, down a narrow stair, and into a wine cellar that was deep enough to muffle sound from the floors above. The ceiling was low. The walls were lined with racks of dark bottles, and in the corner, on an overturned crate, sat a man who looked like someone had taken Lord Dashton of the Southern Chancellery and run him through a press. He was perhaps 60. He had been, presumably, a person of some stature. Now he was unwashed, unshaven, wearing clothes that had not been changed in several days, and holding a glass of wine that was clearly not his first of the morning. His eyes were sharp, though. Whatever else had deteriorated, the eyes were still working. "Lady Vale," Dashton said, "you look like you had a worse night than I did, which is remarkable. I slapped the Duke's mistress in front of 400 people and got removed from the banquet like a piece of furniture," Seraphine said. "So yes, it was a night." Dashton stared at her. Then, slowly, he began to laugh. It was a terrible laugh, the kind that comes out of men who have been frightened for too long and have finally found something that breaks the tension, even if the break is just slightly unhinged. "God, you actually did it. Henrik said you'd do something reckless eventually, but I—" He stopped. The laugh faded. Henrik's name had done it. "He's gone, isn't he?" "Yes." Dashton turned his wine glass in his hands. Once. Twice. The motion of a man who needed to do something with his fingers to keep the rest of himself from shaking. I knew the moment he stopped sending letters. He had a system. 1 letter every 5 days. Even if it was just a single line, nothing important, just a sign that he was still breathing. He paused. The letters stopped. "I know." Seraphine sat on a crate across from him. The cellar floor was cold through her boot soles. The stone walls pressed in close. It was the kind of space that made conversations honest by eliminating the room to perform. "He left me a trail, Dashton. Your name, this cellar, the Greywood vintage." She looked at the rack along the eastern wall. "He said there was a black trunk." Dashton did not move immediately. He looked at her the way people look at someone they are deciding whether to trust. Not a quick evaluation, but a slow, thorough one that scanned for the specific kind of desperation that turns allies into liabilities. Whatever he found in her face must have been sufficient. He stood. He moved to the eastern wall. He shifted 3 bottles of Greywood, reached behind the rack, and pulled a black leather trunk roughly the size of a hat box. He set it on the floor between them. He did not open it. "Before I give you this," he said, "I need you to understand what it costs. Not you, me. I've been hiding in this cellar for 43 days because the moment this information moves, the people who made Henrik disappear will know it, and they will come for whoever is carrying it." He paused. "They will also come for whoever gave it to her." "I know," Seraphine said. "Do you?" "I've been the only person in the room who knew the truth for 3 months, Dashton. I know exactly what it costs. I've already paid most of it." He looked at her hands. She had not realized they were flat on her knees, pressing down the way they had pressed down on the palace marble the night before, that same unconscious reach for something solid. She pulled them into her lap. He did not comment on it. He opened the trunk. Inside, 3 bound ledgers, a stack of correspondence tied with string, and a single leather folder that was thicker than the rest. He lifted the folder and held it out to her. "That is the 3rd set," he said. "Full transaction records for the military fund transfers. Names, amounts, dates, 47 recipients, and 1 name that appears in a separate column in a different ink on 6 of the largest transfers." He met her eyes. "You already know whose name it is." Seraphine opened the folder. She scanned the columns, and there, in the precise and damning repetition of a record that someone had tried very hard to destroy all copies of, the same name appeared 6 times in dark ink against pale paper. Evelyn Marrow. Not initials, not a cipher. The full name. Dated. Witnessed. Irreversible. Seraphine sat with the folder open in her hands and felt something shift inside her. Not relief, because relief would have been premature, and she was past the point in her life where she let herself feel things that she had not yet earned. What she felt was more like the sensation of a locked mechanism finally turning. The kind of click that only happens once, and after which everything either opens or breaks. "There's more," Dashton said. She looked up. 3rd page, bottom quarter. His voice had changed. It was quieter now. Not softer, smaller, in the way voices get when the speaker is not sure they want to be heard saying what they are about to say. "The separate transfers, the ones outside the military fund network. Those are not political bribes, Lady Vale. Those are payment ledgers, contracted services. She turned to the third page. She read the bottom quarter, twice. She closed the folder. Her breathing was even. Her hands were still. Everything on the outside of her body had gone very calm in the particular way that things go calm when the inside has reached a temperature too high for outward display. The hunting guides, she said, the same company. 3 years ago. Commissioned 14 months before the expedition. 14 months. He had been planning his own death, or rather, someone had been planning it for him, 14 months before the morning he rode out into the Greywood with guides he did not know, on a route he had not chosen, toward a cliff edge that someone who was paid very well had made sure would be in his path. Lucien's brother had not died in an accident. He had been navigated to his death by people hired by a woman who was now sleeping, or as near to it as the evening allowed, under Lucien's roof, inside Lucien's protection, wrapped in Lucien's misplaced trust, like a blade wrapped in silk. He does not know, Seraphine said. It was not a question. No. If I bring this to him without, he will not believe you. Dashton said it flatly, not cruelly, with the resignation of a man who had spent 2 months in a wine cellar thinking through exactly these scenarios. Not yet. Not while she still has his ear. The wound of his brother's death is the deepest thing in that man. Whoever tells him that she caused it needs to be standing on ground so solid that there is no version of events, none, in which he can choose doubt over truth. If you go to him now, tonight, with this folder, you will be the woman who slapped an innocent woman at a banquet and is now making monstrous accusations. He will not hear you. He will hear the version of you that she has already built in his mind. Seraphine stared at the folder. The leather was rough under her thumbs. She thought about Lucien's face when he turned away from her in the ballroom. That blank, wall-before-it-breaks expression. The way his hand went to Evelyn's jaw. The way Evelyn's fist had curled behind his back. Then I build the case first, Seraphine said. I corroborate every transfer. I trace every payment to the guides. I find every living person connected to this network who is still breathing and not yet compromised. You would need to move fast. Now that you've made yourself visible, they will be accelerating their timeline. Their timeline for what? Dashton looked at her steadily. You are the 8th name on the list, Lady Vale. The list you've been carrying. You just haven't realized it yet. The cellar was very quiet. Somewhere above them, a floorboard creaked as the steward moved through the house. The wine bottles in their racks held their darkness without comment. Seraphine opened her coat. She pulled out the list she had written weeks ago. The 9 names, the connections, the careful map of disappearances. She looked at the 8th line. She had written it as Lord Dashton of the Southern Chancellery, but that was not what Dashton meant. He reached across and pointed to the 9th name, the last one. The one she had written at the bottom of the list 3 weeks ago when the pattern became too clear to ignore, and then immediately told herself she was being paranoid, and then told herself again and then again, until the repetition of the reassurance had started to feel like its own kind of warning. The 9th name was hers, Seraphine Vale. Henrik put you on that list the week before he disappeared, Dashton said quietly. Not because you were connected to the network, because you were the only person he believed was capable of unraveling it. And because anyone capable of unraveling it, he stopped. Becomes a target, she finished. Becomes a target. She folded the list. She placed the folder inside the black trunk, then looked at Dashton. I'm taking this. I know. If they come for you. I've been in this cellar for 43 days. If they come for me now, it will not be because of you. It will be because they were always going to come eventually. He paused. Take the correspondence bundle too. The letters. 3rd stack. There's one in there written in a cipher that Henrik spent 6 weeks cracking. The decoded translation is tucked inside the back cover of the 2nd ledger. He sat back down on his crate. He picked up his wine glass. His hands were steady, which struck Seraphine as either admirable or deeply worrying. Go, Lady Vale, go before the day gets old. She picked up the trunk. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it to the stairs. Lady Vale. She stopped, looked back. Dashton was staring at his wine. When you find a way to make Lucian Ravenscar hear you, and you will, because you are clearly the kind of woman who finds a way, be careful how you give him the truth about his brother. Some men break clean, some men— He turned the glass in his hands. Some men break in ways that take everyone around them down too. Seraphine said nothing. She climbed the stairs. She strapped the trunk to the saddle, mounted, and turned the horse north. The chalk road was still thick with pale mud. The sky above the valley had gone the color of hammered pewter. It would rain again before noon. She was 4 miles up the road, the estate already out of sight behind the tree line, when she saw the rider. He came from the north, moving fast. Too fast for casual travel. The road was narrow here, barely wide enough for 2 horses to pass without touching, and he showed no sign of slowing as the distance between them collapsed. Seraphine pulled her horse to the verge and watched him come. 50 yards. 30. 20. He reined in hard 10 feet away. The horse blew and stamped. The rider was young, 25 at most, wearing a courier's coat with the seal of the Duke of Ravenscar on the left breast. He stared at Seraphine with the expression of a man who has been given one job and has just run headlong into a complication that his instructions did not cover. "Lady Vale," he said. "Yes, I have—" He reached into his coat. He pulled out a sealed letter. He held it out. "From the Duke. Delivered to your former quarters at the palace and redirected per Lord Thorne's instruction." She took the letter. She recognized Lucien's seal, the raven over crossed swords, pressed in black wax. She had seen it 100 times on correspondence, on official documents, on the ring he wore on his right hand when he attended council sessions. She opened it. The letter was 4 lines. "Seraphine, your behavior last night was inexcusable, and I will not pretend otherwise. However, I am not entirely without conscience. For the sake of your family's standing and your own welfare, I am arranging a formal and quiet dissolution of our engagement to be announced within the week. You will retain the settlement agreed in the original contract. I ask only that you make no further accusations against Miss Marrow. She has done nothing to deserve your cruelty. L." Seraphine read the letter once. She folded it. She pressed it flat against the lid of the black trunk strapped to her saddle. She looked at the courier, who was watching her with the slightly panicked alertness of a man who has never had to witness the person receiving the letter he delivered. "Is there a reply?" he asked. She looked at the letter one more time. Then she tucked it inside the trunk with the ledgers and the correspondence and the payment records for the men who had guided Lucien's brother to his death. "Tell him," she said, and her voice came out steady as a leveled blade, "that I accept the dissolution, and that within the week he will want to take that letter back." The courier blinked. "That is the full reply?" "That is the full reply." She turned her horse off the chalk road toward the eastern tree line, toward a network of contacts and hidden trails, and the slow, methodical work of building something unbreakable out of what everyone had assumed was wreckage. Behind her, the courier sat on his horse in the pale mud and did not move for a long moment. Then he turned north and rode hard for the palace, carrying a message that would reach Lucian Ravenscar in his own study, in his own chair, probably within arm's reach of Evelyn Marrow, who would read the look on the courier's face and understand, with the precise, predatory intelligence that had kept her untouchable for 3 years, that Seraphine Vale had not run. She had gone quiet, and quiet, in Evelyn's experience, was the most dangerous thing a woman could become. She spent 11 days building the case, 11 days of cold rooms, borrowed horses, and conversations conducted in hushed voices behind closed doors with people who were afraid and had every right to be. 11 days of tracing transaction lines through Dashton's ledgers until the numbers stopped being numbers and started being a map. A precise, damning map of money, moving from royal coffers through phantom accounts and landing, again and again, in the hands of people who made problems disappear. She slept 3 to 5 hours a night. She ate when she remembered. She did not think about Lucien. She filed his name in the same place she filed pain, a compartment she could access when the work required it, and seal shut when it did not. The discipline of it was not natural. It was constructed, brick by brick, out of pure necessity, the way you build a wall not because you enjoy masonry, but because the alternative is standing in the open while it rains. By the 8th day, she had corroborated 19 of the 47 transfer recipients. By the 10th, 31. By the 11th morning, she sat at a borrowed writing desk in a farmhouse outside the village of Renmoor, with every document spread before her in order, and she understood the full shape of it. Evelyn Marrow had not built a conspiracy. She had inherited one and expanded it. The original network predated her by a decade. a loose collection of minor nobles siphoning military funds for personal enrichment, the kind of quiet rot that empires develop when the men at the top are too comfortable to look at the foundations. Evelyn had found it, mapped it, and turned it into something surgical. She had used the existing corruption as leverage, pay me or I expose you, and redirected the network toward her own ends: political murder, witness elimination, the strategic positioning of herself inside the court's highest circle of trust. And the brother. The brother was the masterstroke. Kill the right man at the right time, create the grief. Step into the grief like stepping into a room that had been prepared for you. Seraphine stared at the layout of documents for a long time. Then she began to pack them. The Crown Council convened on the 15th of each month for what the charter called the General Assembly of Accounts, a formal session in which financial reports were presented, reviewed, and entered into the official record. It was the one occasion when all 7 council seats were occupied simultaneously. It was the one occasion when anything entered into evidence before the full body became, by charter law, part of the permanent royal record and could not be suppressed or sealed without a unanimous vote. Tomorrow was the 15th. Aldrich met her at the palace's eastern service gate before sunrise, which meant he had been awake all night, which meant he had known she was coming before she told him, which meant his network of quiet informants was still functioning even after the banquet disaster. "You look like 12 days of bad road," he said. "I am 12 days of bad road." She handed him the trunk. "I need this in the council chamber before the session opens. Inside the evidence table, left drawer. The key to that drawer is in the possession of the council secretary, who owed me a significant favor until approximately 3 hours ago when I called it in." He took the trunk without further comment. His face was doing the thing it did when he was more frightened than he was allowing himself to show. A slight tightening around the jaw, a controlled evenness in the eyes that was too controlled to be natural. "Seraphine, don't. I have to. Aldrich, there is something you need to know before you walk in there." She stopped. The pre-dawn air was cold and still. The service gate behind them was iron and rust, and somewhere beyond it the palace kitchens were beginning their morning noise. The clatter of pots, the thud of oven doors, the normalcy of a world that did not know what was about to happen inside its walls. She looked at him. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing the controlled thing. "Tell me," she said. "Lord Vance Caro has been appointed as the 7th council seat, the vacancy left by Lord Meredith's retirement last month." He paused. "Caro's name is on your list." She felt the information land. She felt it arrange itself against everything else she knew. Caro on the council meant one vote in Evelyn's pocket before the session even began. One vote that could call for procedural delay. One vote that could challenge the legitimacy of evidence submitted outside standard channels. One voice in that room that would be working against her in real time. "Which seat?" she asked. "4th chair. Left side." "Left side." 2 seats from Lucien. Close enough to whisper without being seen to do it. "All right," she said. "That's all? All right? What would you like me to say, Aldrich? That it's a setback? It's a setback. I account for it, and I proceed." She pulled her cloak straighter. "I need a council observer's pass. The visitor gallery. Can you—" "Already arranged. Under a clerk's name. You enter through the north passage, 3rd door on the left, after the tapestry room." He reached into his coat and produced a small brass token. "Don't lose that." She took it. Her fingers were cold enough that she could barely feel the metal. "One more thing," Aldrich said. She waited. "Evelyn will be in the chamber. Lucien invited her as a formal guest of the proceedings. Apparently she has expressed an interest in the council's financial reform discussions." He said this last part with the specific flatness of a man reciting something that makes him physically ill. "She will be seated in the primary guest chair, to Lucien's right." Of course she would be. The woman played chess the way other people breathed, without pausing to think about it, without ever fully stopping. She had moved herself into the room before the game even started. "Good," Seraphine said. She meant it, which surprised even her. If Evelyn was in the chamber, the confession, when it came, if it came, would happen in front of witnesses who could not be dismissed. Aldrich stared at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he tucked the trunk under his arm and turned toward the palace. 11 days, he said, without looking back. "I have been in this business for 40 years. I have never seen anyone build a case that fast." She did not answer him. She went to find a place to wait. The gallery above the Crown Council chamber was narrow and warm from the body heat of the dozen clerks and observers already seated when Seraphine slipped into the back row. She found a seat against the wall, angled for a clear sightline to the council table below. The chamber was a long, high-ceilinged room with stone walls softened by tapestries and dark wood paneling. The council table ran down the center like a spine. 7 chairs, 7 nameplates, 7 seats occupied by 7 men who collectively held more power over the kingdom's direction than the bedridden king had exercised in months. The evidence table sat along the left wall. The left drawer was closed. Seraphine scanned the room. Caro was already seated, 4th chair, left side, exactly as Aldrich said. He was a heavy-set man with the kind of face that came from a lifetime of eating well and worrying little, and he was speaking to the man beside him with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the day was already arranged in his favor. Lucien entered 3 minutes before the session opened. He walked in the way he always walked into official spaces, straight, measured, with the particular kind of deliberate composure that meant he had been composing himself since before he left his quarters. He wore the council's formal gray. He sat at the head of the table without looking at the gallery. Eveline entered behind him. She took the guest chair to his right. She wore dark blue today. No ivory. A calculation, probably. Ivory was for the occasion of being seen. Dark blue was for the occasion of being believed. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, the posture of a woman attending to civic duty, and she did not scan the gallery. But Seraphine watched her eyes move. One sweep, practiced, the way you check exits when you enter a building. Fast enough to look like nothing, complete enough to cover the full room. The session opened. Routine items first: agricultural tax assessments, border garrison supply reports, a trade dispute from the coastal provinces. Seraphine sat through all of it with her hands flat on her thighs and her eyes on Eveline's profile. The financial accounts item was 4th on the agenda. The council secretary announced it in the flat, procedural voice of a man who had announced thousands of agenda items and found none of them interesting. Item 4. Review of military procurement accounts, 3rd quarter, including outstanding inquiry into unreconciled transfers flagged by the Treasury Audit Office. Caro's posture shifted. Small, barely visible. The kind of shift that meant he had just received a cue he had been waiting for. "Before we proceed," Caro said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who expected rooms to stop when he spoke, "I'd like to raise a procedural point regarding the audit materials. Specifically, concerns about the chain of custody for any documents submitted outside standard channels." The council secretary looked up from his papers. "The chair recognizes Lord Caro's concern. However, per Charter Provision 9, evidence submitted to the evidence table before session opening is considered formally entered upon the secretary's verification." Verification being the operative word, Caro said. He turned toward the evidence table with the air of a man about to do something he had rehearsed. "I'd like to formally request that the left drawer of the evidence table be opened for verification before any materials are presented." Seraphine's breath caught in her throat. The secretary moved toward the table. He produced his key. He opened the drawer. It was empty. The room was very quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then it erupted. Not in chaos, but in the controlled, pointed noise of men who had just been given a narrative and were already deciding what it meant. Whispers. The shuffle of papers. Caro's voice carrying easily over the rest. "It appears the submitted materials are absent. I would suggest we note for the record that any evidence brought forward under these circumstances must be considered of questionable provenance." That drawer was not empty an hour ago. The voice came from the gallery. Seraphine was standing before she had consciously decided to stand, the brass token in her hand, every eye in the chamber finding her face. "My name is Seraphine Vale. I am here as a registered observer, and the materials that were in that drawer were put there by Lord Aldrich Thorne under the Council Secretary's authorization at the 3rd hour this morning." The chamber went very still. Lucien's head had turned. His eyes found her in the gallery with the unerring precision of a man who had spent 3 years learning to locate her in a room, and they held on her face with an expression she had not seen from him in months. Not anger, not the controlled disappointment, not the public blankness. Something rawer, something that had not been processed yet. To his right, Eveline's hands remained folded on the table. She did not look up at the gallery. She looked at Lucien. "Lord Thorne," the session chair called out. "Is Lord Thorne present?" Silence. The council secretary looked at the door. The door did not open. Seraphine's hands went cold. She turned and moved through the gallery fast, past the clerks who startled out of her way, down the narrow stair at the gallery's end, through the north passage and left past the tapestry room and into the main corridor. Her boots hit the stone floor and she was running before she had finished telling herself not to, because the cold in her hands had spread to her chest, and the cold in her chest was the specific temperature of a truth she did not want to have confirmed. Aldrich was in the corridor outside his quarters. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, and his legs stretched out in front of him like a man who had sat down to rest and found he could not get back up. His face was gray. His breathing was shallow and deliberate, the kind of deliberate breathing that means a person is spending a great deal of energy on an activity that should not require effort. She dropped to her knees in front of him. "What happened?" "I gave the trunk to the secretary," he said. His voice was steady, more steady than his color. "On the way back, I stopped to speak with Warwick, the night guard captain. You know him. And something in my tea this morning." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I think it was the tea. Not an attack. Not a confrontation. Not a blade in the dark. Tea. The most domestic possible vector. The choice of someone who wanted it to look like an old man's body, giving out rather than an assassination, who wanted the council session disrupted by the absence of a witness rather than the scandal of a body." Seraphine pressed her fingers to his wrist. His pulse was present. Uneven, but present. "The trunk," she said. The secretary took it and someone intercepted it between then and the session opening. "Caro," Aldrich said. Not a question. He called for the drawer to be opened, made it a procedure. By the time anyone looks for the materials, they'll have been destroyed or buried, and the record will show they were never properly submitted. She sat back on her heels. Her mind was moving at a speed that felt slightly outside her own control. Too fast, jumping ahead of where she wanted it to go, landing on conclusions she needed more time to examine. They anticipated me. They knew I was coming today. They knew the route. "Someone in my network," Aldrich said quietly. "I am sorry. I was careful. I thought I was careful." "You were careful enough to stay alive." She squeezed his wrist once. "That is sufficient." She stood. She looked down the corridor. The session was still in progress behind the closed chamber doors. Inside that room, Eveline Marrow was sitting to Lucien's right, with her hands folded on the table, and the case that Seraphine had spent 11 days constructing was gone. Not refuted, not disproven, simply removed from the board by people who understood that the truth, as a weapon, is only effective if the person carrying it can get close enough to use it. And then the door at the far end of the corridor opened. Seraphine turned. Lord Vance Caro walked toward her with 2 guards at his flanks, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for this specific moment with something close to pleasure. Behind him, barely visible in the doorway, Seraphine caught a glimpse of pale skin and dark blue fabric before the door swung shut. "Lady Vale," Caro said. He stopped 6 feet away. The guards stopped with him. "You entered this chamber today under a false registry. That constitutes a violation of council security provision." "Where are the documents?" Seraphine said. "I don't know what documents you're referring to." "The trunk, Dashton's ledgers, 47 transfer records and 3 years of payment logs." "Where are they?" Caro's expression did not change. It had the quality of a mask. Not because it was fake, but because the face underneath had decided a long time ago that reacting to things was a form of vulnerability it could not afford. "Lady Vale, you are clearly under significant strain. Your engagement has recently ended. Your reputation has suffered. Is this a performance or a threat? I need to know whether I'm standing here waiting for you to finish the script or whether this is the part where I should start moving." One of the guards took a step forward. "Don't," Seraphine said. Not loud. The guard stopped. Caro regarded her with the patient, unhurried certainty of a man who believed the outcome of this encounter was already determined. "You will be escorted from the palace grounds. Given the circumstances of your recent conduct and today's unauthorized entry, The Duke will be informed and the matter of your future access to Crown buildings will be reviewed. The Duke, she repeated. The Duke. Lucian's name in Caro's mouth sounded like a door being locked. Seraphine looked at Caro. She looked at the guards. She looked at the closed chamber door behind them. Inside that room, 7 men and 1 woman were continuing the session as if nothing had happened, as if the evidence table had always been empty, as if the audit inquiry would wind down to an inconclusive end the way these things always did when the people controlling the narrative had enough votes and enough time. She had lost the documents. She had lost the chain of evidence. She had lost the carefully constructed path from Eveline's name in a ledger to Eveline's face in front of a council that was obligated by charter to act on what it heard. She had 1 move left. 1 move that had no supporting structure, no corroborating documents, no chain of custody, just a truth spoken aloud in a room full of people, and the slim, brutal hope that the truth would hit hard enough and specific enough to do the one thing that documents could not do on their own. Make the guilty person respond. She turned away from Caro. She walked back toward the chamber doors. The guards moved to intercept, and she said, without slowing, "Touch me, and I will name you both in the public record as accessories to the suppression of evidence in a treason inquiry. Your names will be in the record before you finish reaching for my arm. I have a very good memory, and I have a scribe waiting in the observer registry who writes fast." She did not have a scribe, but the guards did not know that, and the hesitation, 2 seconds, enough, was all she needed. She pushed the chamber doors open. The session had moved on to the 5th agenda item. Every head turned. The session chair stood. Lucian's eyes found her instantly, and this time what was on his face was not the unprocessed rawness from the gallery. It was alarm, and beneath the alarm, something that looked almost like recognition, like a man who had been slowly noticing that the picture on the wall was wrong and had just realized he was looking at it upside down. Seraphine walked to the center of the room. She stopped in front of the council table. She put her hands flat on the surface. Both hands, the way she had pressed them against the palace marble the night of the banquet, the way she had pressed them on the cold floor of Dashton's cellar, the way she always pressed them against something solid when the world was trying to make her feel like she had nothing to stand on. "My name is Seraphine Vale," she said. "I was engaged to the first chair of this council until 11 days ago. I am here as a citizen of this kingdom. The evidence I submitted to this table this morning has been removed by at least 1 council member in collusion with an individual present in this chamber, and I intend to state what that evidence contained into the permanent oral record before I can be removed." The room was dead silent. Caro was in the doorway. The guards were behind him. The session chair was on his feet. And to Lucien's right, Eveline Marrow had gone very still. Not the stillness of innocence, but the held stillness of a creature that has identified a threat and is calculating the exact right moment to move. 47 royal officials receive payments from military funds through a shell account network controlled by 1 person, Seraphine said. Lord Caro, 4th chair, seated to your left, is among them. The transactions span 3 years. They include payments to witnesses who subsequently disappeared. And the largest transfers, 6 of them, totaling an amount equivalent to the full annual garrison budget for the eastern provinces, were made to a contractor company that was later commissioned to guide the late Lord Emery Ravenscar on the hunting expedition from which he did not return. The silence in the room changed texture. It went from stunned to something colder and more complicated. Lucien had not moved. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, mirror to hers. His face was doing nothing at all. "The person who controlled those transfers," Seraphine said, and her voice was steady. She would not let it shake now, not now. "Has been operating inside this palace under the protection of a title that does not belong to her, a history that cannot be verified, and a grief that she manufactured." She looked at Eveline. "Her name is Eveline Marrow, and every transaction I have described can be traced directly to her." The room erupted. Multiple voices. Caro's carrying above the rest, calling for removal, calling for procedure, calling for the session chair to restore order. The session chair was calling for order. 2 council members were on their feet, and Lucien Ravenscar had not moved, had not spoken, was looking at Eveline with an expression that Seraphine could not read from where she stood, could not tell if it was the wall before it breaks, or the wall already breaking, or something else entirely, something she did not have a name for because she had never seen it on his face before. Eveline stood. She did not look at Lucien. She looked at Seraphine, and for the first time since the night of the banquet, since the corridor outside the clerk's office, since every calculated public performance Seraphine had witnessed over the past months, for the first time, Eveline's face was not performing anything at all. What was on it was simpler than calculation, more honest than strategy. It was the face of a person who has decided that the only move left is not containment, but destruction. "You have no evidence?" Eveline said. Her voice was clear and cold. "You have no documents. You have a dead clerk's rumors and a disgraced woman's desperation. And this council—" She turned to the table, to the 6 men watching her, to Lucien whose hands had still not moved. "This council knows exactly what kind of woman you are. They saw you at the banquet. They watched you slap an innocent woman in front of the entire court because you could not bear to lose what you believed was yours." "Eveline." Lucien's voice was very quiet. She did not turn to him. She was looking at Seraphine with the full force of 3 years of controlled, patient, predatory intelligence, and there was something almost admirable in it, the way a blade is admirable in the moment before it cuts you. "You want to talk about Emery Ravenscar," Eveline said. Her voice dropped. Not lower. It was already quiet. It dropped in register, in something beneath tone, in the specific frequency of a person saying a true thing for the wrong reason. "Then talk about him. Tell this council how far a jealous woman will go. Invoke a dead man's name in a room full of people who loved him, with no proof, no evidence, nothing but the need to burn everything down because the man you wanted chose someone else." "Eveline," Lucien said again, harder. She turned to him. And what happened next was the thing Seraphine had been counting on, had been praying for, in the place inside her where she still allowed herself to need things to go right. Because Eveline Marrow, for all her precision, for all her 3 years of controlled performance, had one weakness. She could not stand being doubted by Lucien. The doubt was the one variable she had never learned to absorb without responding, because the doubt meant the architecture of everything she had built was cracking at its center. "You believe her," Eveline said. It was not a question, it was accusation. It was panic dressed in 3 layers of composure that were visible now, visible as scaffolding when you knew what to look for. After everything I have been to you and everything she did, you are sitting there with that look on your face and you believe her." "I haven't said anything," Lucien said. "You don't have to say anything. I know that look." Her voice was climbing. Barely. A fraction. "I have spent 3 years learning every look you have. I know when you have already decided something." "Eveline, stop. I handled the guides myself." The words came out of her in a rush. Not a confession, not a choice, but the kind of thing that happens when a person has held a weight for so long that the moment their grip loosens by a fraction, everything drops. The routing was clean. The company had no known royal connections. There was no way to trace it back through the accounts, unless someone had access to the original treasury ledgers, which Henrik was supposed to. She stopped. Her hands, which had been moving as she spoke, went still. The chamber was absolutely silent. Eveline Marrow stood in the center of the Crown Council chamber of Ashenmoor Palace, and the silence around her had the quality of a door swinging shut on an empty room, final, irrevocable, and witnessed by every person who would spend the rest of their lives remembering exactly where they were standing when it happened. Lucien was looking at her. His face had broken. Not dramatically, not the collapse Seraphine might have imagined in a weaker version of this moment. It was a smaller fracture, quieter, the kind that goes all the way through. Seraphine stood with her hands on the council table and felt the truth settle into the room like sediment dropping through water, slowly, completely, and in a way that no current could reverse. She had won. The evidence was gone, and she had won anyway, because in the end, Eveline's only weapon had been the space between what was suspected and what was said aloud, and she had just collapsed that space herself. But as the guards moved toward Eveline, as the session chair called for order with a voice that had lost its procedural flatness and gained something genuinely shaken, as Caro in the doorway turned and walked quickly away from what was no longer a controllable situation, Seraphine looked at Lucien. He was still looking at Eveline, still sitting, still not moving. 3 years of grief and trust and the careful private architecture of a man who had believed he knew someone were reorganizing themselves in real time behind his eyes. And what was happening there was not justice. It was devastation. And it was not going to be a clean kind. Seraphine pulled her hands from the table. She straightened. She turned toward the chamber doors because whatever came next, the arrest, the inquiry, the unraveling, would happen without her needing to witness it. She had done what she came to do. The truth was in the room. It could not be taken back out. But at the door, she stopped. Because Lucian's voice came across the chamber, low and stripped of everything except the bare weight of a man asking the only question he had left. How long? She did not know if he was asking her or Eveline. She did not turn around to find out. She walked through the doors and into the corridor, and behind her she heard Eveline's voice begin the explanation. Not a confession, but the desperate retroactive construction of justification. The attempt to make a man understand that she had done what she did for reasons that made sense from the inside, that the grief she had manufactured was also, in some terrible way, real, that she had loved him in the only way she knew how, which was the way predators love things, by making sure they could not leave. Seraphine did not listen. She walked until the voice faded. She turned a corner. She leaned against the wall. She slid down until she was sitting on the floor with her knees pulled up and her head back against the stone, and she closed her eyes. She had no evidence. She had no documents. She had no trunk, no ledgers, no carefully corroborated chain of transfer records. She had walked into the council chamber with nothing but the truth, and the calculated bet that a guilty person pushed hard enough would reach for the truth themselves to use as a weapon, not realizing until too late that truth does not take sides. She had been right, and being right had cost her everything she planned to use as a foundation for what came next. She opened her eyes. The corridor ceiling was stone and shadow. Somewhere deeper in the palace, she could hear raised voices. The specific quality of institutional chaos, the sound a building makes when something inside it has fundamentally changed, and no one has had enough time yet to decide what comes after. Seraphine pressed her hands flat against the floor, cold, solid, present. She had 11 days of work and no physical record of it. She had Dashton in a wine cellar and Aldrich sitting against a wall with a racing pulse, and an enemy who was now cornered, which meant more dangerous than she had ever been with room to maneuver. She had the truth on the record and no power to enforce what happened next. She needed something she had never needed before. She needed allies who sat at tables she had never been invited to. People with institutional authority, with seats in chambers that did not require a brass observer's token to enter. People who had watched the kingdom's corruption from close range and had their own reasons for wanting it burned out. And she had exactly one name. Someone Dashton had written at the bottom of his cipher. Someone Henrik had circled 3 times in a different color. Someone who had stayed silent for 3 years, watching, waiting, accumulating the kind of quiet leverage that only becomes visible when someone with nothing left to lose finally kicks the structure hard enough to make it shake. The initials S.E. She had spent 11 days building a case without knowing who they were. Now the case was gone and she had one move left, and she needed a name, a real name, behind 2 letters that a dead man had trusted enough to hide inside a locked trunk, inside a locked cellar, behind a rack of wine that nobody touched. She stood up. She was not done. She was not even close to done. What she was, what the last 12 days had made her, in the place where she used to keep certainty and warmth, and the comfortable belief that doing the right thing was enough to protect you, was something harder. Something that had stopped asking whether the road ahead was fair and started asking only whether it was navigable. Whatever came next, she would navigate it. She walked toward the light at the end of the corridor, and behind her, in the chamber she had just left, a man was sitting at the head of a council table with the face of someone who had just learned that the ground he built everything on was not ground at all. She did not look back. The initials S.E. belonged to a woman named Sable Ashenmoor. Seraphine found this out in the time it took to walk from the council corridor to the palace's eastern archive room, where a junior records clerk named Pell, 19 years old, terrified, and apparently one of the 6 people in the palace who had decided Seraphine Vale was worth the risk of loyalty, pressed a folded note into her hand without being asked, and disappeared back into the stacks before she could speak. The note contained 2 things, a name and an address. Sable Ashenmoor, former senior auditor to the Crown Treasury. Removed from her post 14 months ago under circumstances the official record described as voluntary resignation for personal reasons, which in palace language meant she had been pushed and had chosen to fall quietly rather than be thrown loudly. Her address was a townhouse in the merchant quarter, 12 minutes on foot from the palace's east gate. Seraphine walked it in 9. The townhouse was narrow, 3 stories, with a ground floor that had been converted into a working office. The front door opened before she knocked. Sable Ashenmoor stood in the doorway and looked at Seraphine the way people look at things they have been expecting for a long time and are relieved to finally see, even when the relief is complicated. She was perhaps 45, sharp-featured, compact, with the kind of stillness in her body that came not from calm but from the long practice of containing things that needed containing. Her eyes moved over Seraphine's face, her coat, the absence of the trunk. They took it, Sable said. Not a question. Caro, before the session opened. Come in. The office was small and dense with paper, not chaotic but layered, the way a working mind layers things when it has been processing the same problem from multiple angles for a long time. Maps on one wall, columns of figures on another. A single desk with 2 chairs and a lamp burning low despite the morning light outside. On the desk, open, was a ledger that Seraphine recognized. Not the specific volume, she had never seen this particular copy, but the format, the column structure, the handwriting in the marginal notations. Henrik's system. He sent me copies, Sable said, sitting. She gestured at the second chair. Every transaction he found, he copied twice. 1 set to Dashton, 1 set to me. He didn't tell either of us about the other because he understood that if one channel was compromised, the other needed to survive. She paused. He was very careful. Not careful enough. No. Her voice did not flinch, but something in it absorbed the weight of the statement and held it. He was careful enough to make sure the work survived him. That is a different category of careful. She closed the ledger. The documents Caro took, they are already destroyed. I have been monitoring 3 of his household staff through a contact network I built after my removal from the treasury. The trunk was burned in his private fireplace within the hour. Seraphine's jaw tightened. She had known it. Had known the moment the drawer opened empty that the trunk was gone for good. But hearing it confirmed carved a specific kind of hollow into the chest. What do you have? She said. Everything Henrik had, plus 14 months of my own work since he disappeared. Sable reached under the desk and produced a leather satchel. She set it on the surface between them. This is the full record. Original documents, not copies, including 3 sets of transfer records that were pulled from the Treasury archive the night before my removal, and which I had the foresight to photograph using a reproduction process. I will explain if we survive the next 48 hours. Seraphine looked at the satchel. It was thick, heavy in the way that things built from years of meticulous, patient, dangerous work are heavy, with the specific gravity of evidence that has cost its accumulator more than it should have taken. Evelyn confessed, Seraphine said, in open session, partial, reflexive, but recorded by the session secretary. That gives us a toehold. A toehold is not a footing. Sable's voice was flat, precise. The voice of a woman who had spent 20 years distinguishing between what was sufficient and what was adequate and had 0 patience for conflating the two. Caro will argue coercion, emotional distress. He will call 6 witnesses who will testify that you provoked her. The session secretary's record can be challenged on procedural grounds if the chair rules the session was improperly convened at the moment of your entry. She paused. We have 48 hours before the council reconvenes for an emergency session that Caro has almost certainly already arranged. At that session, the narrative will be set, not in our favor. Then we move first. Yes. Sable stood. She picked up the satchel. We move now, though. What happened in the next 6 hours was not a plan exactly. It was the execution of something more like organized desperation. The kind of action that looks like strategy only in retrospect, when the people telling the story have the benefit of knowing it worked. In the middle of it, it felt like running through a burning building with a map that might be outdated, toward exits that might not be there. Sable had contacts, more than Aldrich, differently placed, not nobles or political allies, but institutional people. The kind that palace intrigue tends to overlook because they do not hold council seats or carry titles. Treasury clerks, garrison record keepers, 2 magistrates from the civil courts, a senior physician attached to the council chambers who had, over 14 months of careful observation, compiled a medical record of Eveline's presence in the palace that included signed documentation of 3 separate incidents in which individuals had reported physical symptoms consistent with low-dose poisoning within 48 hours of consuming food or drink in her presence. The physician. That was the piece Seraphine had not had. That was the piece that made the difference between a financial conspiracy, which powerful men had survived before, and something that a court of law could not look away from. By midday, Seraphine and Sable had assembled 7 people in a private room at the back of the civil magistrate's building, 3 streets from the palace. The room smelled of old wood and ink and the particular staleness of spaces used for serious conversations over many years. The 7 people were frightened, every one of them. Fear was in the room like a 7th person, present, acknowledged, and set aside because the alternative to acting frightened was acting paralyzed, and paralysis was the one luxury none of them could afford. Seraphine stood at the head of the table and looked at the faces watching her and understood, with a clarity that sat somewhere between exhaustion and focus, that these people were not heroes. They were functionaries and clerks and one nervous physician, and they were here not because they were brave by nature, but because they had each reached a private threshold, a point at which the cost of continuing to stay silent had finally exceeded the cost of the risk. That was what courage looked like when it was not performed. It looked like ordinary people who had simply run out of reasons to wait. "Here is what we need," she said. She did not dress it up. She laid it out the way you lay a hand of cards on a table, flat, visible, all of it, the evidence they had. The confession on record, the gap between what they could prove and what Caro's emergency session would attempt to neutralize, the 48-hour window, what each of them needed to do. No one left the room. The warrant was filed at the 3rd hour of the afternoon. Civil jurisdiction, not council jurisdiction, a distinction that Sable had spent 14 months engineering because council jurisdiction could be stalled by procedural challenges, but a civil warrant for conspiracy to commit murder, filed under the kingdom's standing criminal code by a magistrate of sufficient rank, had to be executed within 4 hours of filing, or the filing magistrate faced mandatory censure. Caro did not know about the civil filing. He was in the palace, managing the emergency council session arrangements, operating on the assumption that the battlefield was institutional and the weapons were procedural. He had spent 3 years operating in that assumption, and it had served him well. He had not accounted for a woman who had run out of institutional options and simply changed the game. The palace guards who arrived at Evelyn Marrow's quarters at the 4th hour were not council guards. They were civil enforcement officers, accompanied by 2 magistrates and carrying documentation that the palace's internal security apparatus had no authority to refuse or delay. Evelyn was in her sitting room. She was dressed. Her luggage, Seraphine learned later, had been partially packed, which meant she had known the window was closing and had been preparing to move. She was not fast enough. Seraphine was not there for the arrest. She heard about it afterward, in pieces, from Sable and then from Aldrich, who had recovered enough from the morning's incident to be upright and furious and determined to be present for the parts of the day he had not been able to participate in. She was in the civil magistrate's building when the confirmation came through, sitting in the same back room that now smelled of cold tea and spent adrenaline, and when Sable told her, she nodded, said nothing, put her head back against the wall and closed her eyes for 30 seconds. That was all she allowed herself, 30 seconds. Then she opened her eyes and said, "Caro." "His warrant is processing," Sable said. "The magistrates are moving carefully there. He has more institutional protection than Evelyn. He is an active council member, which means the council chair has to be formally notified before execution. They expect resistance. He will try to use the council session as cover, if he can get into that chamber and call the session to order before the warrant is executed. He can invoke legislative privilege and delay everything by weeks." "Yes." "When does the session convene?" 2 hours. Seraphine stood up. She reached the palace at a run and did not care who saw her. The corridor outside the council chamber was crowded. Council staff, guards, a cluster of noble observers who had caught wind of the day's events and positioned themselves with the specific, predatory attentiveness of people who wanted to be present when history happened and could describe it afterward as though they had participated. She pushed through the crowd without apology. 2 guards at the chamber doors recognized her and moved to block. She stopped 2 feet from them. "The session has not been called to order," she said. Her voice was stripped down to its essential components. No volume, no performance, just the flat, clear delivery of a woman who had been awake for most of 32 hours and had metabolized the fear somewhere around hour 20 and come out the other side into something that was not fearlessness, but was functionally indistinguishable from it. You have no authority to exclude a citizen from the observer gallery until the chair calls order. You know that. I know that. Step aside. They stepped aside. The chamber was fuller than that morning. Word had spread the way words spread in palace spaces. Through the specific osmosis of whispered conversations in corridors and the acute political sensitivity of people who had survived by knowing which way the current was moving before it shifted. Both gallery sections were full. The council table held 6 of 7 chairs occupied. Caro's seat, 4th, left side, was empty. Lucien was at the head of the table. He had not changed from the gray council formal he had been wearing that morning. His face showed the particular deterioration of a man who has been carrying something unbearable for several consecutive hours without putting it down. He looked up when Seraphine entered the gallery. Their eyes met across the chamber for 3 full seconds. She looked away first. Not because she was avoiding him, because she needed to find Caro, and she could not afford to let 3 seconds become 4. Caro was not in his seat. She scanned the chamber. Not in the gallery, not near the evidence table. She turned to check the entrance corridor behind her and found, instead, Caro 12 feet away, moving fast through the public entrance with 2 men at his flanks who were not guards, who moved wrong for guards, too loose in the shoulders, eyes scanning rather than fixed, and whose hands were positioned in the way that hands position themselves when they are used to reaching for things quickly. Caro's eyes found Seraphine. His step faltered for 1 beat. Then his jaw set and he kept moving, angling not toward his council seat but toward the side door that led to the chamber's antechamber where the session chair waited for the formal opening call. If he reached the session chair. If he called the session to order from that antechamber. If he invoked the emergency session agenda he had arranged. Seraphine moved. She did not think through the geometry of it. The body does not do geometry when the margin is this thin. It does something more primitive, the calculation of angles and distances that exists below language, in the part of the brain that developed before words did. She cut across the gallery stair landing, hit the main floor at the bottom in 3 steps, angled through the cluster of observers near the gallery entrance, and stepped directly into Caro's path. He stopped. The 2 men with him stopped. The nearest observers scrambled back. A ripple of sharp silence spread outward from the spot. Caro looked at her. Up close, his face showed something that his composure had been successfully hiding all day. Not fear exactly, but the specific stress response of a man whose planned outcome has been progressively collapsing and who is now operating on improvisation in a situation that was supposed to be controlled. Sweat at his temples, jaw too tight, breathing slightly elevated. He was frightened, and frightened men with nothing left to lose were the most dangerous kind. "Get out of my way, Lady Vale," he said. "Quiet. For the room, not against it." "The civil warrant for your arrest was filed at the 3rd hour," Seraphine said. "Just as quiet, just as level. It will be executed within the next 20 minutes. Entering that antechamber and calling this session to order will not delay it. It will add obstruction of civil process to the existing charges." She paused. "Sit down, Caro." His eyes moved, not to her, past her, to the 2 men flanking him, and the look he gave them was the specific economic communication of people who have worked together long enough to speak without words. She saw it. She read it. She had approximately 4 seconds. The first man moved toward her left. She stepped right. The second man was already moving right. They had done this before, or something like it, and they were fast. And her back hit the chamber wall, and one of the men had her arm, and the other was between her and Caro, who was already moving toward the antechamber door, and there were people shouting now. The room was in motion, and Seraphine did the only thing available to her. She made noise. Caro's warrant. Her voice at full volume, stripped of every social inhibition that years of palace life had layered over it, was something different from her usual register, raw and carrying and impossible to talk over. "Civil warrant. 4 counts. Name is on record." The man holding her arm tightened his grip. She did not try to pull free. She kept her eyes on Caro. He was at the antechamber door, hand on the handle. "Lord Caro," Lucien's voice. From the council table. Not raised. Lucien never raised his voice in the chamber. She had never heard him do it. but carrying with the particular density of a voice that has authority so deeply embedded in its structure that volume becomes irrelevant. Every sound in the room died. Caro's hand stayed on the door handle. His back was to the room. "Step away from that door," Lucien said. 3 seconds. 4. 5. The man holding Seraphine's arm had gone still, caught in the same suspended moment as everyone else in the room. Caro turned around. His face had resolved into something past fear, that flat, committed expression of a man who has decided that if he is going down, he will choose the manner of it. His eyes found Lucien. Then they found Seraphine. "She has destroyed everything," Caro said. Not loudly, with the precise articulation of genuine belief. Everything that kept this council functional, the networks that fund the border garrisons, the relationships that keep the eastern provinces from open revolt. You think what she's building here, out of dead clerks and stolen ledgers and a woman's spite, you think that survives contact with the real cost of governance? She doesn't know what she's pulling apart. "Emery," Lucien said. One word, his brother's name, dropped into the room like a stone into deep water. She pulled apart what happened to Emery. Caro's jaw tightened. The flat, committed expression cracked, not into guilt, but into something more complicated. The look of a man who had made a calculation 3 years ago and had been living inside the mathematics of it ever since, and was only now, in this room, confronting the full cost of the variables he had decided not to count. "I didn't know about Emery," Caro said. "Not until it was done." "And by then you were already paid," Seraphine said. Her arm was still held. She did not move. Her voice was very quiet. "By then the transfer was in the record, and the record was yours to protect. So you protected it. For 3 years. While he, she looked at Lucien. While he grieved a brother who was murdered, and you sat at his table and took his trust and spent it." The man holding her arm let go. She did not know if it was deliberate or reflexive. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Caro. Caro looked at Lucien. Whatever he was looking for in that face, absolution, understanding, the specific mercy that comes from being known by someone who has power over you, he did not find it. Lucien's face was closed. Not the blankness of the banquet night, not the controlled disappointment. This was something foundational. The expression of a man who has revised a core belief and is standing in the aftermath of that revision, in the wreckage of a trust he now has to account for having given. The chamber doors at the far end opened. 2 civil enforcement officers entered. Behind them, a magistrate. The warrant documentation in hand, the seal visible from across the room. Caro looked at the officers. He looked at the magistrate. He looked at the room. The gallery full of witnesses, the council table, Lucien at its head, Seraphine against the wall with the red mark of a grip already forming on her forearm. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man totaling a final account. Then he did something Seraphine had not predicted and would spend months afterward trying to fully understand. He straightened. He buttoned his coat. He walked toward the civil officers himself without being approached, and he held out his wrists. Not with dignity exactly. With the specific, exhausted compliance of a man who has been holding something heavy for 3 years and has finally decided that setting it down, even this way, is preferable to carrying it one step further. The officers moved to him. The magistrate began the formal recitation. The chamber watched in the particular collective silence of an audience that has been present for something that will be recounted for decades, and knows it, and is not yet sure how to hold the knowledge. Seraphine let her back slide down the wall until she was standing fully on her own legs. She pressed her right hand against her forearm where the grip had been. It would bruise. She catalogued it and moved on. She looked at Lucien. He was looking at her. Across the chamber, across the council table, across the distance of everything that had happened between the banquet and this room, across all of it, his eyes were on her face, and what was in them was the thing she had been most afraid of, because it was the hardest to know what to do with. Not anger, not the controlled disappointment that had been his default setting for their last months together. Recognition. The specific, devastating recognition of a man who has finally understood the full shape of something he has been looking at from the wrong angle for a very long time. She held his gaze for one moment. 2. Then she looked away and moved toward the chamber doors because the arrest was proceeding and the session chair was beginning the formal record notation, and the next several hours would require her full attention, and there would be documents to review and testimony to organize, and the specific grinding institutional work of turning a broken morning into a permanent record that could not be walked back. She was almost at the doors when his voice came across the room. "Seraphine." She stopped. Her hand was on the door frame. The wood was cold under her palm. Outside, through the gap, she could hear the corridor noise picking up, the information traveling outward, the palace reorganizing itself around a new reality. She did not turn around. "I know," she said. "Not now, Lucien." She pushed through the door and into the corridor, and the noise swallowed her. And behind her in the chamber, the session chair's voice rose in the procedural cadence of official record, naming names, citing statutes, setting into permanent language the events of a day that had started before sunrise and showed no sign of finishing before dark. The work was not done. Evelyn was arrested but not tried. Caro was in custody but not convicted. The network of 47 names in the original ledger remained largely intact, its members distributed across the kingdom's administrative body like shrapnel buried too deep for a single operation to remove. It would take months. It would take the kind of sustained, careful, relentless institutional pressure that required people in rooms she still did not have access to, fighting battles she had not yet fully mapped. And Sable's satchel was still in her coat, heavy against her ribs, full of the documentation that would outlast this day and the next, and every attempt to bury it. Seraphine moved through the corridor with the particular velocity of a person who has no more margin for pause. Her arm throbbed. Her eyes were dry from hours of not sleeping enough. Her boots were still mud-stained from the chalk road outside Dashton's estate. She had not eaten since before dawn. None of it mattered. What mattered was the 12 feet between her and the East Corridor Junction, and after that the 20 feet to the Archive Annex, and after that the 2 hours of work that would convert the contents of the satchel into a formally filed evidentiary record that would exist in the civil court system independently of the council, independently of palace jurisdiction, independently of any single person's authority to suppress. She had been the only person in the room who could see the fire, while everyone else stood around complimenting the warmth. She was done complimenting the warmth. She turned the corner and walked directly into the man she had been least prepared to face, in the service alcove at the junction of the east and north corridors, where the torchlight was dim and the foot traffic was thin, and there was absolutely no crowd to use as a buffer or a reason to keep moving. Lord Aldrich Thorne, on his feet, pale but functional, his coat straightened, his eyes carrying the specific quality of someone who has decided that whatever his body is doing, it will simply have to wait. He held out a folded paper. "This arrived for you 10 minutes ago. Messenger from outside the palace. Unmarked seal." She took it. She unfolded it. 3 lines. No signature. "Dashton is gone. Took the eastern road before dawn. He left something for you behind the south gate post at Renmoor. He said you would understand the location. He said, tell her Evelyn was not working alone. The original architect is still free, and the original architect knows her name." Seraphine read it twice. Then she folded it with the precise, unhurried care of someone whose hands are the only part of them that are still fully under control. The original architect. Not Evelyn, not Caro, not any of the 47 names in the ledger. Someone above all of it. The person who had built the network a decade before Evelyn found it, who had handed it to her like a weapon and stepped back far enough to avoid the blast radius. Someone who was still free. Someone who now knew that Seraphine Vale had just torn apart everything their architecture had taken a decade to build, and who from this moment forward had every reason in the world to make sure she could not do it again. Aldrich was watching her face. He was reading it the way he always read it, carefully, without comment, cataloging the information and waiting for her to decide what to do with it. She tucked the note into her coat alongside the satchel. She looked at him. "How fast can you move?" she asked. "Faster than this morning," he said. "Slower than I'd like. It'll have to do." She started walking. "There's one more name, and we need to find it before it finds us." The thing Dashton left behind the south gate post at Renmoor was a name. Just a name. Written in his handwriting on a strip of paper wrapped in oilcloth and pressed into a gap in the stone where a 10-year-old child would have found it plain and an adult on horseback would have ridden past without looking. Seraphine crouched in the early evening mud beside the gatepost and unfolded the oilcloth and read the name twice and felt the specific sensation of a puzzle she had been working on for weeks, suddenly resolving into a shape so obvious that she could not understand how she had missed it. Lord Aldrich Thorne stood behind her, holding both horses, saying nothing. She stood up. She turned around. She held the paper out to him. He read it. His face did not change in any dramatic way. It settled. That was the word for it. The way a building settles when it has been absorbing pressure from a specific direction for a long time and finally acknowledges the source. His jaw tightened once. Then he handed the paper back. "How long have you known?" Seraphine said. It was not quite an accusation. It was the question underneath an accusation, the one that matters more. "I suspected," Aldrich said, "for 11 months. I had no proof. And the suspicion was the kind that, if I was wrong, would have destroyed a relationship I could not afford to destroy." He paused. "I told myself that was the reason I held it." "Was it?" He looked at her steadily. The evening light was thin and gray and made everything look like a photograph of itself, a little flattened, a little too real. "No," he said. "The real reason was that I was frightened, which is something I am not accustomed to being, and something I handled by pretending the suspicion was not certainty." Seraphine looked at the name on the paper. Lady Corinth Vale, her father's older sister, her aunt, the woman who had sponsored Seraphine's introduction to court 7 years ago, who had navigated the family's political connections with the smooth, practiced fluency of someone who had been operating in palace spaces since before Seraphine was born, who had been, for as long as Seraphine could remember, the one person in the Vale family who always seemed to know which way things were moving before they moved, because she was the one moving them. The original architect. The network predated Evelyn by a decade. Corinth Vale had been 42 when she built it, a woman with significant social capital, no official title beyond her married name, and the specific invisibility that the court extended to women who were not young enough to be desired or powerful enough to be feared. She had used that invisibility the way a knife uses a sheath, quietly, completely, until she was ready. And when Eveline Marrow had arrived at court 3 years ago, young, brilliant, ruthless, and looking for infrastructure, Corinth had handed her the keys to a machine that had been running for a decade and said, in whatever words she had used, "Use this. And in exchange, make sure the one person in this family with enough clarity to see it never gets close enough to matter." Seraphine. From the beginning, the target had always been Seraphine, not because Seraphine had done anything, because Corinth had looked at her niece at 15, counting candles in a ballroom, and had seen something she recognized and could not allow to develop unchecked. She thought about the banquet, about Evelyn's perfectly timed approach, the precisely calibrated provocation, the tears that started the moment Seraphine's hand connected. She thought about how clean it had been, how thoroughly the narrative had been prepared before the evening even started. It had not been improvised. It had been engineered by someone who knew Seraphine well enough to predict exactly where her threshold was and how to push her past it in public. Only one person in the world knew her that well. Corinth Vale's townhouse was on the respectable side of the merchant quarter, close enough to the palace to signal relevance, far enough to suggest she did not need proximity to maintain it. The kind of address that communicated confidence without ostentation, which had always been Corinth's register in everything she did. Seraphine arrived alone. She had not told Aldrich where she was going, had told him, in fact, to go to the civil magistrate's office and begin the process of filing the name on the paper into the evidentiary record, which was both the correct procedural step and the specific kind of task that would keep him occupied and away from what came next. He had looked at her when she said it. He had known what she was doing. He had let her do it anyway, because he was 62 years old and had spent 4 decades in palace politics, and understood that some conversations could not be witnessed without changing them. The housekeeper who answered the door recognized Seraphine. Her face did the complicated thing that faces do when they are caught between social script and genuine alarm. Seraphine said, "I know she's home," and walked past her into the front hall. Corinth was in the sitting room. She was dressed for evening, as though she had planned for visitors. She probably had. She was 61 years old and had been operating at this level of the game for 20 years, and she had known since the council chamber that afternoon, or perhaps since the moment Seraphine rode south toward Dashton's estate 11 days ago, that this visit was coming. She looked at Seraphine the way you look at something you built and watched develop, and are genuinely, complexly proud of even as you understand it has come to dismantle you. There was no pretense in her face. That, more than anything else, was what hit hardest, the absence of the performance. After months of watching Evelyn's face perform everything, the sight of Corinth's face simply being still was almost more than Seraphine could process. "Sit down," Corinth said. "I'd rather stand." "I know. Sit down anyway. Your legs have been moving for 32 hours, and you are going to need to be steady for this conversation." Seraphine sat. Corinth looked at her hands folded in her lap. Then she looked up. "How much do you know?" "Enough. Dashton left your name. Sable Ashenmoor has 14 months of documentation tracing the network's origins. The original incorporation of the shell accounts goes back 19 years, which predates Evelyn by 7 years, and coincides with the year after my father refused to support your position on the Eastern Trade Commission." Corinth's mouth tightened. 1 degree. "Your father was a fool." "My father was a quiet man who tried to stay out of the way of people like you, and died with nothing to show for his family and nothing to protect his children with. His quietness was not virtue. It was abdication." The words were sharp, but the tone was not angry. It was the tone of a genuinely held belief delivered without apology. "I built something. I built the infrastructure that kept the Vale family name relevant for 2 decades, while your father sat in his library and pretended that distance from power was the same as integrity. You built a murder machine. I built a leveraged network. What Evelyn did with it, you handed her the tools. You handed her Emery Ravenscar's name." Seraphine's voice did not rise. She had made a decision somewhere on the road here that she would not perform this conversation. She would simply have it. You knew what she was capable of when you brought her in. You knew, and you decided that the outcome was acceptable. Corinth was quiet for a moment. The sitting room clock ticked. Outside, the city was doing its evening things. Carts, voices, the settling noise of a world that was happening indifferently around a room in which something that had been buried for years was being dug up in real time. "I did not know about Emery until it had happened," Corinth said. "That is the truth. I want you to have the truth, even if you decide it changes nothing. It changes one thing. It means you are complicit in covering up a murder you did not commission, which is a different charge from the one that covers the rest of it, but it is still a charge." "Yes." Corinth looked at her. "I know." Seraphine studied her aunt's face. She was looking for what she had spent months looking for in Evelyn's face and never found. Something genuine behind the composure. Something that was the person rather than the position. And she found it, which was both harder and simpler than she had expected. What she found was a woman who was tired. Genuinely, deeply, 20 years of it tired. Not remorseful in the simple way, not wringing her hands, not performing contrition, but worn in the specific way of someone who has been carrying a structure for so long that the structure has started to feel like the only thing holding them upright, and they have known for a while now that it is also the thing that is going to bring them down. "Why me?" Seraphine said. "From the beginning. Why make me the target?" Corinth looked at her for a long moment. "Because you were the only one in this family who was ever going to be sharp enough to see it. Your father never looked. Your brother never cared, but you—" She stopped. Her hands still folded, pressed together slightly. "You counted the candles in the ballroom when you were 15. Not because you were nervous, because you were mapping the room. I watched you do it. And I knew then that if you ever had enough information and enough reason, you would do exactly what you have spent the last 3 months doing. So you decided to eliminate the threat before it materialized. I decided to manage the variable." She paused. "I was wrong. Not strategically. I was right that you would do this. I was wrong about the other part." "What other part?" Corinth looked at her niece. Her jaw worked once, very slightly, the way it did when she was choosing words with more care than usual. "The part where I told myself it was necessary. The part where I looked at a 15-year-old girl counting candles and decided she was a variable instead of a person." She exhaled, short, controlled, but real. "I have been in this business long enough to know that the moment you start looking at people that way, as assets, as threats, as pieces. You have already lost something you cannot get back. I knew it when I did it. I did it anyway. The room was very quiet. Seraphine sat with her hands flat on her knees and felt the complicated, unwanted weight of a truth she had not been prepared for. Not a monster at the center of the maze, but a person. A person who had made a series of choices that had compounded over 20 years into something that had consumed everything around it, including themselves. That did not make it forgivable. It did not make her anger wrong, but it made the anger a different shape than she had been carrying it in, and the reshaping hurt in a way she had not budgeted for. I have filed your name, Seraphine said. The civil record, Sable's documentation. It will proceed. I know. I'm not here to give you the chance to ask me to stop it. I know that too. Corinth stood. She moved to the writing desk in the corner of the room and opened the top drawer and removed a thick folder that she held out toward Seraphine without crossing the room. Just held it at arm's length, the gesture of someone offering something across a distance they understand cannot be closed. These are my records. Everything. The full accounting from the beginning. Chain of custody, authorization signatures, payment logs. More complete than anything Dashton or Sable have. She paused. I have been keeping them current for the past 14 months, since Henrik disappeared. I knew eventually the weight of it would require a full account, and I decided that if the account was coming, I would give it clearly. Seraphine stood. She crossed the room. She took the folder. It was heavier than Sable's satchel, fuller. The handwriting on the top page was Corinth's, precise, unambiguous, the handwriting of a woman who had spent a lifetime making sure what she wrote could not be misread. This will put you in a civil court, Seraphine said. Yes. For years. Yes. And everything you built is already finished, Corinth said. It finished the moment Evelyn spoke in that chamber. I built the architecture, but the architecture required her competence to run. Without it, the network collapses inward. She paused. You collapsed it, Seraphine. You and a dead clerk and a woman in a wine cellar and a physician who kept careful notes. You brought it down with nothing. I want you to understand that. I want it to mean something to you, even if everything else I have done means the opposite. Seraphine held the folder against her chest, both arms across it, the way she had carried Henrik's journal on the night of the banquet. She stood in her aunt's sitting room and looked at the woman who had spent 7 years trying to neutralize her, and understood, with a clarity that felt like the last piece of something settling into place, that there was nothing left to fight. Not because the fight was won. The courts would be months, the trials longer, the dismantling of what remained of the network a sustained and grinding institutional process that would require Sable's precision and Aldrich's connections, and the careful, unglamorous work of people who showed up every day to do the one right thing available to them. That was not over. But the part that had been personal, the part that had started in a ballroom with 612 candles and ended in this sitting room with a folder of confessions, that was over. I hope the courts are fair to you, Seraphine said. She meant it, which surprised her. Not generosity exactly, something more functional. The recognition that hoping for fairness was not the same as hoping for mercy, and that she had spent enough of herself on this to be done performing feelings she did not have. She left. She did not look back. The formal dissolution of Evelyn Marrow's network took 4 months. The trials took longer. Seraphine was present for the initial hearings and not present for most of the rest. By the time the cases reached their extended procedural stages, she had other things to build. She left Ashenmoor in the early spring, not fleeing. That distinction mattered to her, mattered enough that she spent 3 days ensuring it was clear in the record and in her own understanding that she was departing under her own terms, with her reputation formally restored by a council declaration that the session chair had fought for and Lucien had co-signed without being asked. She read about the co-signature in a letter from Aldrich. She put the letter in the same compartment where she kept things she would think about later, when there was room. She went east. The eastern provinces were what the palace had been trying to protect for 20 years by any means available, including corrupt ones. The border territories, the garrison towns, the villages of women and children left behind by military campaigns that the corrupt fund network had systematically underfunded. She had read about them in Dashton's ledgers, in the accounting of where the money had not gone, in the negative space of every transaction that had lined someone's pockets instead of shoring up the walls. She built something there. It took time, and it was not elegant, and it required her to negotiate with people who did not want to negotiate, and persuade people who did not want to be persuaded, and stand in rooms where she was the only woman and make herself heard through sheer, unromantic persistence. It required her to be wrong sometimes and correct it and continue. It required her to ask for help, which she was bad at, and accept it imperfectly, which she was also bad at, and learn over time to be slightly less bad at both. What she built was a house, first. A specific house, in a specific town, for the specific purpose of giving women who had been abandoned by the noble system, wives whose husbands had died in underfunded campaigns, daughters whose families had dissolved under economic pressure, women like Seraphine herself who had been designated variables in other people's calculations, a place to be people instead. The house became two houses. Two became a small estate. The estate became, over several years, a network of its own, not the kind that moved money in the dark, but the kind that moved information and resources, and occasionally just a warm body to stand beside someone who needed someone standing beside them. Seraphine ran it with Sable, who turned out to be a better administrator than either of them expected, and a surprisingly functional human being once she had a purpose that did not require hiding in metaphorical wine cellars. Aldrich visited twice a year, always complaining about the road, and always staying a week longer than he planned. She did not think about Lucien every day. She thought about him the way you think about things that have changed you. Not constantly, not with the acute destabilizing pain of the immediate aftermath, but with the periodic, almost involuntary recognition of a person who has left a mark on the architecture of who you are. What he had done to her in that ballroom was real. What he had failed to see was real. Neither of those things had stopped being true. She did not revise them into something more comfortable as time passed, because false comfort was a debt that compounded, and she had decided somewhere in the chalk road mud outside Dashton's estate that she was done taking on debt she would have to repay later. She also did not pretend she had not loved him. Pretending that would have required revising herself, and she was not in the business of revision anymore. He came on a Thursday, 2.5 years after Evelyn's arrest. She knew he was coming because Aldrich wrote to tell her, not asking her permission, not framing it as anything other than information, which she appreciated. He arrived in the afternoon. He came alone, no escort, which told her something about the nature of the visit. He looked like 2.5 years of a man who had been doing the hard, unglamorous work of reckoning, not just with Evelyn's crimes and Caro's betrayal, and the exposure of a network that had been running under his nose, but with his own specific failures, the choices he had made in the ballroom, the protection he had extended to a woman who was lying to him at the cost of the woman who was telling the truth. She met him at the gate. She had not planned the location. It was simply where she was when he arrived, supervising the installation of a new water cistern. But it felt appropriate afterward. The gate, the threshold, the demarcation between what was his world and what was hers. He stood on the other side of it and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the silence between them was not awkward. It was full, the way silences are when there is too much to say, and both people know the sequence matters. "You look like you've been building something," he said. "I have been building something." He looked at the estate behind her, the main house, the two outbuildings, the vegetable plot that one of the residents had started and that had expanded to a size nobody planned and everybody used, the line of washing strung between the eastern fence posts. He looked at it the way you look at a place that has been made by someone you know, trying to understand what it says about the person. "Can I come in?" he asked. "No," she said, not sharply, cleanly. "Not today, Lucien." He absorbed this without flinching. "Then I'll say what I came to say here." "All right." He looked at her. His hands were at his sides, which was how he stood when he was not performing composure, but actually had it. The difference between stillness as mask and stillness as the genuine condition of a person who has processed something all the way through. "I spent the first 6 months after the trials trying to write you a letter," he said. "I wrote 11 of them. I burned all 11 because every version of the apology I could construct was accurate and insufficient at the same time. I could explain what I was thinking and why I believed what I believed, and none of that explanation changes what I chose, or what it cost you." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." So I stopped trying to construct the explanation, and started trying to change what was changeable. He paused. I resigned the first chair of the council. I've been working with the Garrison Reallocation Commission, the military funds, the border territories. Some of the work overlaps with what you're doing out here. He looked past her at the estate again. I've been learning how much damage was done in places I never looked at. Good, she said. She meant this too. Not warmly. Or not only warmly. Practically. The work mattered, and it needed doing. And the fact that he was doing it was genuinely useful to the people it served, which was the only measure that had ever mattered. He looked at her for a long moment. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, even if the answer is what I think it is. Ask. Is there anything I can do? Not to undo it, not to change what happened, just... He stopped. The composure cracked slightly. That specific small fracture she had seen in the council chamber, the one that went all the way through. Is there anything I can do? Seraphine looked at him. She looked at the question in it. Not the version of the question that was about them, about the engagement, about the years of trust and the ballroom and the guard's grip and all of it, but the deeper version, the one underneath, the question of a person who has broken something irreparable and has had to learn to live in the world of having broken it and wants to know if there is any version of forward that is available. She knew that question. She had asked a version of it herself, in the corridor outside Corinth's sitting room, standing with a folder of confessions against her chest, trying to understand how to live in the world of knowing that someone who was supposed to protect her had spent years systematically ensuring she could not become herself. The answer she had found, over 2.5 years of building something in the mud of the eastern provinces, was not the answer she had expected. It was smaller and more functional and less dramatic than she would have designed for herself. It was simply, do the work that is in front of you, not to redeem the past, not to earn back what was lost, just because the work is there and it matters and you are here, and that is enough of a reason. Keep doing what you're doing, she said. The garrison reallocation, the border territories. Keep looking at places you never looked. She paused. And when you find something that needs someone standing beside it, stand beside it. Not for me, just because it needs standing beside. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked once. He nodded. She stepped back from the gate. Her hand rested on the iron bar of it, cold under her palm, solid, present. Lucienne, she said. He looked at her. I don't hate you. She said it carefully, because it was a specific truth, and she wanted it to land with the precision it deserved. I want you to know that, not because it changes anything, just because it's true, and you came all this way and you deserve the truth. Something moved across his face. Not relief, something quieter than relief. The look of a man receiving something he had not allowed himself to expect and does not know immediately what to do with. He stepped back from the gate. Thank you, he said, quietly, without dressing it up. She closed the gate between them. Not hard. Not final in the way that doors are final when there is violence behind them. Final in the way that a chapter is final. Complete, sealed, holding everything it contains without apology and without the need to continue. She walked back toward the main house. The afternoon light was low and long, and the shadows of the outbuildings stretched east across the yard. From the kitchen window she could hear voices. 2 women she had brought out from Ashenmoor 3 months ago, both of them rebuilding something out of circumstances that had not been their choice, both of them finding in slow, unglamorous increments that rebuilding was possible even when you were doing it without a map. She went inside. The door closed behind her. The kitchen smelled of bread and wood smoke. Sable was at the desk in the back room, annotating something, her ink-stained fingers moving with the precision of a woman who had found, in the conversion of chaos into record, something that felt enough like purpose to build a life around. Seraphine sat down at the kitchen table. She pressed her hands flat against the wood. It was warm from the afternoon sun that came through the south window, warm and solid and real, and she stayed there for a moment, simply holding that. The warmth, the solidity, the uncomplicated fact of a surface that simply was what it was. Then she picked up the pen someone had left on the table, pulled a blank sheet toward her, and began writing the letter she had been putting off writing to the magistrate in the next county over about the 3 women from the garrison village who needed documentation to claim the land rights that were legally theirs and that no one had helped them file for, because no one in an official capacity had yet decided that their situation was worth the paperwork. She worked until the light failed. Then she lit the lamp and kept working. Outside, somewhere on the eastern road, a man rode back toward a capital that was still, slowly, painfully, learning to look at the places it had not looked. And in the east, in the province that the corrupt ledgers had bled dry and that the clean ones were now beginning to rebuild, a woman sat at a kitchen table and did the unglamorous, necessary daily work of the world, not because she had won exactly, though she had, but because she had survived the fire and come out the other side, and the other side turned out to be a place where things needed doing. That was enough. It was, she had learned, more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.